No one cared who I was till I
started a channel.
If I pull that off, will you die?
It would be extremely painful.
You're a big guy.
For you.
Good evening, good morning, YouTube. Salutations, wherever you're at. So recently, I've been doing a buddy read with my friend and esteemed colleague, Giveslav. Seriously, go check out his channel. The guy is really intelligent, makes some really great, interesting videos. Very knowledgeable about 20th century historical fiction, but just in general knows a bunch of stuff. So he really is a good guy. I've had correspondence with him, so please go check him out. I will link him and tag him in the description. Again, I genuinely consider him a friend, so if you guys don't mind giving him a try, I would appreciate that. So recently, as we've been doing a buddy read, and we've been reading mostly Harold Lamb and Robert E. Howard, as those two authors have some links. Robert E. Howard has cited Harold Lamb as one of his favorite authors. But the two primary books we've been reading out of have been, we've been reading out of Swords of the West, which I'll put the cover right here. Most people have been watching my videos have seen that. And then we've also been reading Robert E. Howard, which we did start with some Conan stories, just kind of due to how well known Conan is. But then we've also been reading out of this, which is recently what we just read out. This is Lord of Samarcand. If you don't know what this book is, this is Robert E. Howard's historical fiction. So on top of, Robert E. Howard wrote all kinds of stuff, westerns, boxing stories. Considering that he died at a pretty young age, was deceased pretty early on in life, he was rather prolific, so and wrote a lot of stuff. And then, of course, on top of Conan and all that, he also wrote this. Most of his historical fiction stories are set during the Crusades. So for this reading, like I said, we read out of this book right here. We might have read a few different stories from each other, but we both read the namesake story, Lord of Samarcand, and then I also read Gates of Empire and the Lion of Tiberius, or Tiberius, however you want to say that. I will probably mostly talk about Lord of Samarcand, and I'll just go over this. And again, right off the bat, in my opinion, this is a classic of historical fiction that has been highly influential. Obviously, Robert E. Howard some of his first stories were from this. And just a little bit of a brief background. There are some materials out there of Robert E. Howard saying that, one, not only that he very much liked Harold Lamb as an author and was one of his favorite authors, but that also he didn't stick with historical fiction as much because he didn't have the resources to do so. He was, I think he grew up relatively poor in rural Texas, and so just didn't have access to all the materials. I don't know if Robert E. Howard spoke other languages or could read in other languages the way Harold Lamb could. So he just didn't quite have the resources to be able to write as much historical fiction. Despite that, these stories at least seem very well researched for what they were. They're mostly action adventure anyway. So I'll get into Lord of Samarcand. And again, when Robert E. Howard wrote this story, the namesake story here, Lord of Samarcand, I don't think he expected anybody to be reading the Grand Cham right next to it, which is by Harold Lamb. They are incredibly similar. Everything from the protagonist, they both start with the Battle of Neapolis, which is a crusade battle, one of the last crusade battles that the Crusaders lost to Bayezid. I have some imagery of Bayezid I'll put up here. Bayezid was an Ottoman Turk, one of the first really kind of successful ones. Maybe not one of the first, but was up there, just an important figure in that part of the world. So it starts with that battle, and then eventually, and I'll just kind of get some of this out of the way, because it's striking how similar it is to Harold Lamb's story. But then it ends with the Battle of Ankara, which, if you don't, Ankara, I'll put this up here. Ankara is the modern day capital of Turkey. But in that battle, Bayezid loses to Timur. And I'll put up a map right here of the Timurid Empire that I have. And Timur is such an interesting historical figure to me because despite his incredible success and just how influential and how many things he did, in the West, we just don't learn that much about figures like Bayezid or Timur or the Middle Eastern history in general. Just even though it's incredibly interesting, incredibly fascinating. Timur is a bit of a descendant from the Mongols. He's a Tatar, however you want to say that, which are related to the Mongols. Like they speak a Turkic language. Anyway, so and at least in this story, like I said, it starts with the battle in the apocalypse. The survivor, the protagonist, survives that battle. He ends up working for Bayezid. And he does that because, it's part of his plot to get revenge on him. Again, very similar to the Grand Cham in that way. But because he wants to get revenge on Bayezid. And then, kind of dedicates his life to this. Because many years go by in between these battles. I can't remember. I think it's about 6 years off the top of my head. But it might be a little more than that. And then he eventually goes and works for Timur as well. Again, very similar to the Grand Cham. All those things. Like I said, the similarities are striking. I don't think it derails the story or takes anything away from it because there are differences. Robert E. Howard, like I said, Harold Lamb, I'd give an edge in research, maybe a little bit in description of the area and like the history, where Robert E. Howard is a more, visceral, kind of writes a gratuitous violence. Perfect for Valentine's Day, right? Sorry, it's not funny, but... but he's really good at writing. Robert Howard's, obviously excellent at writing action. So I'd give him the edge there. I might even, upon further consideration, I might give Lord of Samarcand a slight edge over the Grand Cham. But I would say Harold Lamb's other historical, like the Black Road, is way better than Gates of Empire and what was the other one, Line of Tiberius. But just to go over this story real quickly, like he goes and works for Timur and then helps Timur defeat Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara. And again, this is a very good story with great description. Something Robert E. Howard is very good at as well. Despite this story, Lord of Samarkand, only being a little over 30 pages, if the story feels much bigger than that, and he's really good at that. Just at any time it's characters are just done traveling or about to start a battle, and it makes the story feel bigger, like it's been going on, and we're just getting a snapshot in it. And that's usually, especially when it comes to sort of more action and adventure-oriented short stories, I think that's like a sign of a very good short story. It doesn't have to be that. That's not, not a critical criteria of a short story, but I think it works really well. And I'm going to read just a quick passage out of it. And this is the protagonist talking to Bayezid, or at least one of his associates, about Timur. So it says, "Timur will crack you like a walnut," said he deliberately. "Have you seen the Tatars in war array? Have you seen their arrows darkening the sky as they loosed? 100,000 as one? Have you seen their horsemen flying before the wind as they charged home and the desert shook beneath their hoofs? Have you seen the array of their elephants with towers on their backs, whence archers send shafts in black clouds, and the fire that burns flesh and leather alike pours forth?" I think that's a pretty good paragraph right there. And I really like the Timur will crack you like a walnut. He actually uses that a couple times. But anyway, it's excellent, man. And especially since I read this right next to the Grand Cham, Robert Howard not only a lot of the story elements the same, but he uses a lot of similar vocabulary. He's not quite as good as using the that sort of Shakespearean language, which is like the thou and thee and thine. Because I did catch some errors in that, and that's okay, right? Stuff like that's going to happen, but. My point is that he's just not quite as good at it as Harold Lamb was, where Harold Lamb was kind of a master at it. But this story is excellent. Like I said, despite that, I would probably give this an edge over the Grand Cham. To talk about the other two stories I read, I wasn't as impressed by those. They're very good, and I enjoyed them. I would say Gates of Empire is better than Lion of Tiberius. I'm not going to get into a bunch of the plot on them because this video would take forever if I did. And just like I said before, I would say like Harold Lamb's The Black Road or Lionheart are head and shoulders above better than those two stories. But this is very good. I really enjoyed these a lot. All three of them were very good. Again, Robert E. Howard didn't write in historical fiction as much as Harold Lamb did. And I would definitely recommend this entire book. Just from those 3 stories I read, they are excellent. So all 3 of them. Lord of Samarcand is fantastic, and you could read that in an afternoon and felt like you read you'd feel like you read a whole book. So I definitely recommend this story to anybody who hasn't read it. I think I already covered this, but the similarities with Harold Lamb are real, like, again, striking, because he even uses a lot of similar vocabulary as Harold Lamb. A lot of something kind of else interesting about Robert E. Howard is almost all these stories take place around the Crusades, so he was obviously very interested in that time. One of the stories is in the early Crusades, which is something you don't really see get a lot of historical fiction, the early Crusades. And then again, and then in just modern literature and modern historical fiction, I almost see nothing set in the Crusades. You have to really read like older, like historical fiction to get a lot of Crusade stories, set in that era. Even though it's a very interesting time. Maybe I think some of that's due to just the complicated history of the Crusades, because they just went on forever. There's multiple, the first, second, third, Crusades, and just all that stuff, and then. Just the way, like, the kingdom, the Westerners or European holdings in that part, in that area were complicated and confusing. So I think that's why it doesn't get as much play, but in modern day historical fiction. But it is a very interesting period to learn about. Because I was looking stuff up. I'm no expert on the Crusades, so it does make me want to do some research on the area. Which I could read Harold Lamb's book on the Crusades. I could put that up here. Dan Jones has one. I did recently read Dan Jones' or his Templars book, which covers a lot of Crusade stuff, as the Templars were they played a very critical role in that. But anyway, this is really good. This is a historical fiction classic, if you ask me. Again, this is very, like, just from what I've read, and I've read some of these stories before. Like, I think I've read Shadows of the Vulture. I had read some of these stories before, so it's not. I wasn't coming into this, brand new. I don't think I'd ever read Lord of Samarcand. Gates of Empire was eerily familiar to me, so I know I'd read, because I've read a bunch of Robert E. Howard. And a lot of this stuff, almost all of these you can access for free. I think if you get on the Project Gutenberg Australia page, you can read it directly on the browser right there. Anyway, again, these are very good. None of these have any of the art in them, which is unfortunate. I think I saw a YouTube channel that did some audiobooks of these, and maybe if you're interested in that, all these stories, especially in that format, will be very short. Another thing kind of about the, short fiction at this time is very dense. The word count is very high. So, even though it's not very many pages, it might take you a little while to read it, but again, it's not too terrible. But again, these are very good. I definitely recommend this. As a connoisseur of short stories, I really enjoy these. I found these really fun. Again, Lord of Samarcand, at least if you're only going to read one story out of this, I would read the namesake story. And again, I would consider this an important work of historical fiction, just due to how influential Robert E. Howard is as an author. So anyway, that's all for today, YouTube. I'll put some maps and stuff in here. I didn't get as much into the plot because the plot is so similar to the Grand Cham, but it was still very good. I really enjoyed it, man. I read this story in like 2 hours, so it was. I read it very quickly despite the word density. So, and even kind of some older language and stuff, I still got through it rather quick. Again, check out my buddy Kiev Teslov. Really smart guy. Really great channel. Just talks a lot about really interesting books. I think that'll be all for today. Good night or good day, wherever you're at.